Dean Corll was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana to Mary Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. Corll's father was strict with him and his younger brother Stanley. Corll's mother was extremely protective of her sons. Corll was a shy, serious child who seldom socialized with other children. At the age of 7, Corll suffered an undetermined case of rheumatic fever, which was only noted in 1950 when doctors found Corll had a heart condition and he was ordered to avoid P.T. at school, where he was regarded as a well-behaved student who achieved satisfactory grades. Corll also played trombone in his high school band. In 1946, Corll's parents divorced but later remarried and moved to Pasadena, Texas in 1950. By 1953, following the second divorce of his parents, Corll's mother married a traveling salesman with whom she had a daughter named Joyce in 1955. Corll's mother would start a small candy company along with her second husband, operating from the garage of their home, and almost immediately Corll was working day and night while still attending school. At the age of 19, the family moved to Houston Heights and opened up a new shop called Pecan Prince. In 1959, Corll moved to Indiana to live with his grandparents. He stayed in Indiana for almost 2 years, even forming a close relationship with a local girl. Later, Corll returned to Houston in 1960 to help with his family's candy business following the breakdown of his mother's second marriage in 1963. Corll's mother appointed him vice president of the company and he moved into an apartment above the shop. On August 10, 1964, Corll was drafted into the U.S. Army and was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. He was later assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, before his permanent assignment at Fort Hood, Texas as a radio repairman. Corll reportedly hated military service. He applied for hardship discharge on the grounds that he was needed to help run his family's business. The Army granted his request and he was given an honorable military discharge on June 11, 1965, after 10 months of service. Speculation remains as to whether Corll first realized he was gay while he served in the Army. Corll would return to Houston, Texas to resume his position within his family's candy business. By 1965, shortly after Corll completed his military service, the Corll Candy Company moved across the street from a Heights elementary school. Dean Corll was well known for giving free candy to local children, especially teenage boys. The family company also employed a small workforce and Dean was seen to behave flirtatiously towards several teenage male workers. He even installed a pool table at the rear of the factory where employees and local youths would congregate. By 1967, Corll had befriended a then 12-year-old David Brooks, who would later on take part in the murders Dean Corll would later commit. Following the failure of his mother's third marriage, Corll's mother and half-sister moved to Colorado. Although they often talked on the telephone, she never saw her son again. By June 1968, the Corll Candy Company closed down for good. Corll, like his father, took a job as an electrician at the Houston Lightings and Power Company. He worked there until the day he was killed by one of his accomplices. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll is known to have killed at least 27 victims. All of Corll's victims were young males between the ages of 13 and 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. Most victims were abducted from Houston Heights, which was then a low-income neighborhood northwest of downtown Houston. With most abductions, Corll was assisted by one or both of his teenage accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks. Several victims were friends of one or the other of Corll's accomplices, and 2 other victims, Billy Balch and Mally Winkle, were former employees of the Corll Candy Company. Corll's victims were typically lured into his van with an offer of a party or a lift and driven to his house. There, they were either plied with alcohol until they passed out, tricked into putting on handcuffs, or simply grabbed by force. They were then stripped naked and tied to Corll's plywood torture board, where they were sexually assaulted, tortured and, sometimes after several days, killed by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. The victims were then tied in plastic sheeting and buried in one of 4 separate locations: a rented boat shed, a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, in Woodland near Lake Rayburn, where Corll's family owned a lakeside log cabin, or on a beach in Jefferson County. Dean Corll jumped up and said, "I'm just having some fun," and he promised me a car if I kept quiet. Later he admitted he killed them, and he bought me a Corvette. David Brooks describing his discovery of Corll assaulting two boys in 1970 to Houston police officers in his initial statement, August 8, 1973. In several instances, Corll forced his victims to either phone or write to their parents with explanations for their absences in an effort to allay the parents' fears for their son's safety. Corll is also known to have retained souvenirs, usually keys, from his victims. During the years Corll is known to have abducted and murdered young men, he frequently changed addresses, however, until he moved to Pasadena in the spring of 1973, he always lived in or close to Houston Heights. Jeffrey Allen Connon, aged 18. Murdered September 25, 1970. Corll killed his first known victim, an 18-year-old college freshman named Jeffrey Connon, on September 25, 1970. Connon vanished while hitchhiking with another student from the University of Texas to his parents' home in Houston. He was dropped off alone at the corner of West Hamer Road and South Voss Road near the Uptown area of Houston. At the time of Connon's disappearance, Corll lived in an apartment on Yorktown Street, near the intersection with West Hamer Road. Corll likely offered to drive Connon to his parents' home in the Bresswood Place West University Place area. David Brooks led police to the body of Jeffrey Connon on August 10, 1973. The body was buried at High Island Beach. Forensic scientists subsequently deduced the youth had died of asphyxiation due to manual strangulation and a cloth gag which had been placed in Connon's mouth. The body was found buried beneath a layer of lime, wrapped in plastic, naked and bound hand and foot, suggesting Connon had also been violated. Around the time of Connon's murder, David Brooks interrupted Corll in the act of assaulting two teenage boys whom he'd strapped to a plywood torture board. Corll promised Brooks a car in return for his silence. Brooks accepted the offer and Corll bought him a green Chevrolet Corvette. Brooks was later told by Corll the two youths had been murdered, and he was offered $200 for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. Donald Waldrop, murdered January 30, 1971. On December 15, 1970, David Brooks lured two 14-year-old boys named James Glass and Danny Yates away from a religious rally held near Houston Heights to an apartment Corll had rented on Columbia Street. Glass was an acquaintance of Brooks who, at Brooks' behest, had previously visited Corll's apartment. Both youths were tied to opposite sides of Corll's torture board and subsequently raped, strangled and buried in a boat shed Corll had rented on November 17. 6 weeks after the double murder of Glass and Yates, on January 30, 1971, Brooks and Corll encountered two teenage brothers named Donald and Jerry Waldrop walking to a bowling alley. Both boys were enticed into Corll's van and driven to an apartment Corll had moved to at 3200 Mangum where they were raped, tortured and strangled before Brooks and Corll buried the youths in the boat shed. Between March and August 1971, Corll killed four more boys between the ages of 13 and 17, as with the Waldrop brothers, all lived in Houston Heights. Many were lured to Corll's apartment by Brooks, usually with the promise of a party. David Hilligiest and Gregory Malley-Winkle. Both youths disappeared May 29, 197 in the winter of 1971, following the August murder of 17-year-old Reuben Watson. Brooks introduced Helmer Wayne Henley, then aged 15, to Dean Corll, apparently as an intended victim. Corll decided Henley would make a good accomplice and offered him the same fee, $200, for any boy he could lure to his apartment, informing Henley that he was involved in a sexual slavery ring. Henley accepted Corll's offer, and initially participated in the abductions of the victims, then later actively participated in many of the killings. The first known killing Henley participated in was that of Willard Branch, a 17-year-old Houston youth who was abducted while hitchhiking in February, 1972. Henley assisted Corll in the abduction of the youth and tricked Branch into donning a pair of handcuffs before leaving him alone with Corll, who subsequently paid Henley $200 for assisting in the abduction. 1 month later, on March 24, Henley assisted Corll in the abduction of 18-year-old Frank Aguirre, a youth he personally knew who worked in a local restaurant. Aguirre was lured to Corll's house and tricked into donning a pair of handcuffs before Henley again left him alone with Corll. Henley later claimed to having discovered Corll torturing the youth, upon which Corll informed him he had raped, tortured and killed the previous victim, Branch, and that he intended to do the same with Aguirre. Henley was again paid for luring the victim to Corll's home and gradually became Corll's major procurer of victims, although David Brooks still played a lesser role in the abductions. According to Brooks, on one occasion in 1972, Henley knocked him unconscious as he entered Corll's apartment. Corll then tied Brooks to his bed and assaulted him repeatedly before releasing him. Despite the assault, Brooks continued to assist Corll in the abductions of the victims. Between February and December 1972, a minimum of 8 teenagers were murdered, 4 of whom were buried at High Island Beach, and 4 inside Corll's boat shed. In the spring of 1973, following the February murder of 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, Dean Corll moved to Pasadena. By July 7, a further 3 victims had been murdered and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 12, a 17-year-old youth named John Sellers was murdered and buried at High Island Beach. 1 week later, on July 19, a 15-year-old named Michael Balch was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. By August 3, Corll had killed a further 3 youths between the ages of 13 and 18, all of whom he buried inside his boat shed. At approximately 3 a.m. on the morning of August 8, 1973, Henley, aged 17, invited a 19-year-old youth named Tim Curley to attend a party at Corll's Pasadena house. Curley, who was intended to be Corll's next victim, accepted the offer. The 2 youths arrived at Corll's house accompanied by a 15-year-old girl named Ronta Williams, a friend of Henley. David Brooks was not present at the time. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl along. He told him in private that he had ruined everything. Henley explained that Ronta had argued with her father that evening, and did not want to return home. Corll appeared to calm down and offered the 3 teenagers beer and marijuana. The 3 teenagers began drinking and smoking the marijuana as Corll drank beer and watched them intently. After 2 hours of drinking and smoking, the 3 teenagers each passed out. Henley awoke to find Corll snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. His ankles had also been bound together. Curley and Williams had also been tied with nylon rope, gagged with adhesive tape and tied to opposite sides of Corll's torture board, Curley on his stomach, Williams on her back. Curley had also been stripped naked. Corll told Henley he was furious he had brought a girl to his house, and explained he was going to kill all 3 teenagers after he had assaulted and tortured Curley. He then dragged Henley into his kitchen and placed a .22 caliber pistol against his stomach, threatening to shoot him. Henley calmed Corll, promising to participate in the torture and murder of both Williams and Curley if Corll released him. Corll agreed and untied Henley, handing him a hunting knife and ordering him to cut away Ronta's clothes, insisting that while he would rape and kill Curley, Henley would do likewise to Ronta Williams. Henley began cutting away Ronta's clothes as Corll undressed and tried to assault and torture Tim Curley. Both Curley and Williams had awoken by this point. Curley began writhing and shouting as Williams lifted her head and asked Henley, "Is this for real?" To which Henley replied yes. Ronta then asked Henley, "Are you going to do anything about it?" Henley then asked Corll if he could take Ronta into another room. Corll ignored him and the youth then grabbed Corll's pistol, shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean." Corll approached Henley, saying, "Kill me, Wayne." Henley stepped back a few paces as Corll continued to advance upon him, shouting, "You won't do it." Henley fired at Corll, hitting him in the forehead. Corll continued to lurch towards him and Henley fired a further 2 rounds at him, hitting him in the left shoulder. Corll spun round and staggered out of the room, hitting the wall of the hallway. Henley fired a further 3 bullets into his lower back and shoulder as Corll slid down the wall in the hallway outside the room where the 3 teenagers were bound. Corll died where he fell, his naked body lying face towards the wall. Wayne Henley outside Corll's boat shed on August 8, 1973. He is seen here phoning his mother to confess to having shot Corll. After shooting Corll, Henley released Curley and Williams from the torture board and all 3 teenagers dressed and discussed what actions they should take. Henley suggested to Curley and Williams that they should simply leave, to which Curley replied, "No, we should call the police." Henley agreed and looked up the number for the Pasadena police in Corll's telephone directory. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8, Wayne Henley placed a call to the Pasadena police. His call was answered by an operator named Velma Lines. In his call, Henley blurted to Lines, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." Henley gave the address to the operator as 2020 Lamar Drive, Pasadena. As Curley, Williams and Henley waited upon Corll's porch for the police to arrive, Henley mentioned to Tim Curley that he had done that, killed by shooting, 4 or 5 times. Curley later informed detectives Henley had also informed him, "I could have gotten $200 for you." In custody, Henley explained that for almost 3 years, he and David Brooks had helped procure teenage boys, some of whom were their own friends, for Corll, who had raped and murdered them. Corll had paid $200 for each victim he or Brooks were able to lure to his apartment. 81. Henley gave a statement admitting he had assisted Corll in several abductions and murders of teenage boys, informing police Corll had buried most of his victims in a boat shed in southwest Houston, and others at Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island Beach. Police were initially skeptical of Henley's claims, assuming the sole homicide of the case was that of Dean Corll, which they had ascribed to a result of a drug-fueled fisticuffs that had turned deadly. Henley was quite insistent, however, and upon his recalling the names of 3 boys, Corll, Hilligiest and Jones, that had been procured by himself and Brooks for Corll, police accepted that there was something to his claims. All 3 teenagers were listed as missing at Houston Police Headquarters. David Hilligiest had been reported missing in the summer of 1971, the other 2 boys had been missing for just 2 weeks. Moreover, the floor of the room where the 3 teenagers had been tied was covered in thick plastic sheeting. Police also found a plywood torture board measuring 7 by 3 feet with handcuffs in each corner. Also found at Corll's address were a large hunting knife, rolls of clear plastic of the same type used to cover the floor, a portable radio rigged to a pair of dry cells to give increased volume, a number of dildos, thin glass tubes and lengths of rope. Police began to excavate Corll's boat shed on August 9, 1973. The Ford Econoline van belonging to Corll parked in the driveway conveyed a similar impression. The rear windows of the van were sealed by opaque blue curtains. In the rear of the vehicle, police found a coil of rope, a swatch of beige rug covered in soil stains and a wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides. The pegboard walls inside the rear of the van were rigged with several rings and hooks. Another wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides was also found in Corll's backyard. Inside this crate were several strands of human hair. Henley agreed to accompany police to Corll's boat shed in southwest Houston, where he claimed the bodies of most of the victims could be found. Inside Corll's boat shed, police found a half-stripped car, which turned out to have been stolen from a used car lot in March, a child's bike, empty bags of lime and a box full of teenage boys' clothing. He, Henley, started to take a step inside the boat shed, but then his face just turned ashen, pale, grim. He staggered around outside the door. "Right then's when I knew there were going to be bodies in that shed." Houston police officer describing Henley's actions upon leading police to Corll's boat shed on August 8. Police began digging through the soft, shell-crushed earth of the boat shed and soon uncovered the body of a young blonde-haired teenaged boy, lying face up and encased in clear plastic, buried beneath the layer of lime. Police continued excavating through the earth of the shed, unearthing the remains of more victims in varying stages of decomposition. Most of the bodies found were wrapped in thick, clear plastic sheeting. Some victims had been shot, others strangled. 94. The ligatures still wrapped tightly around their necks. All of the victims found had been sodomized and most victims found bore evidence of sexual torture. Pubic hairs had been plucked out, genitals had been chewed, objects had been inserted into the victims' rectums, and glass rods had been shoved into their urethra and smashed. Cloth rags had also been inserted into the victims' mouths and adhesive tape wound around their faces to muffle their screams. In some instances, Corll had also castrated his live victims. Severed genitals were found inside sealed plastic bags. On August 8, a total of 8 corpses were uncovered at the boat shed. David Brooks presented himself at Houston Police Station on the evening of August 8, and gave a statement denying any participation in the murders, but admitting to having known Corll had raped and killed two youths in 1970. On August 9, police accompanied Henley to Lake Sam Rayburn in San Augustine County, where Henley had told police Corll had buried four victims he had killed in 1973. Two further bodies were found in shallow graves. Police found a further 9 bodies in the boat shed on August 9. David Brooks gave a full confession that evening, admitting being present at several killings and assisting in several burials, although he continued to deny any direct participation in the murders. He agreed to accompany police to High Island Beach to assist in the search for the bodies of the victims. Wayne Henley, left, and David Brooks, right, in handcuffs, pictured on High Island Beach on August 13, 1973. On August 10, Henley again accompanied police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where two further bodies were found buried just 10 feet apart. As with the two bodies found the previous day, both victims had been tortured and severely beaten, particularly around the head. That afternoon, both Henley and Brooks accompanied police to High Island Beach, leading police to the shallow graves of a further two victims. On August 13, both Henley and Brooks again accompanied police to High Island Beach, where 4 more bodies were found, making a total of 27 victims, the worst killing spree in American history at the time. Henley initially insisted that there were 2 more bodies to be found inside the boat shed, and also that the bodies of a further 2 boys had been buried at High Island Beach in 1972. At the time, however, the killing spree was the worst case of serial murder, in terms of number of victims, in the United States, exceeding the 25 murders attributed to Juan Corona from California, who was arrested in 1971 for killing 25 men. The Houston mass murders, as they became known, hit the headlines all over the world. Even Pope Paul VI commented on the atrocious nature of the crimes and offered sympathy to relatives of those who had died. Police were inundated with inquiries regarding missing boys from parents across the United States. By April 1974, 21 of Corll's victims had been identified, and all but 4 of the youths had either lived in or had close connections to Houston Heights. 3 further teenagers were identified between 1983 and 1994, 2 of whom also lived in Houston Heights, although Henley has consistently disputed the 1994 identification of a body unearthed from the boat shed as being that of Mark Scott, whom he claims he, Brooks and Corll buried at High Island Beach in 1972. Families of Corll's victims, which included 2 who had lost 2 sons each to Corll, were highly critical of the Houston Police Department, who had been so quick to list the missing boys as runaways who were not considered worthy of investigation.